You just have to click on the got it if you want to stay in the call. Hopefully you do. And I'll wait until I get a thumbs up from Anna if we're good to go. Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Pfeiffer. I am an education coordinator with the Canadian Light Source. And welcome to a Students on the Beamline seminar brought to you by students connecting from Our Lady of the Rockies High School in Calgary, Alberta. Before we get to their presentation, just have a couple housekeeping items. So we are live streaming through YouTube just to keep the recording. So if you want to keep your videos off, you're more than welcome to. For those of you joining in on the Zoom call, you do have some viewing options. There's an icon in the top right-hand corner of your screen. You can select it and select different options, especially if you want to see the speakers as they present their story. There's also going to be a Q&A session at the end. For those of you that are in the Zoom call, feel free to unmute yourselves, pose a question in chat, or raise your hand, and the students will call upon you to ask a question. And yeah, I think that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and get the students to share theirs as I continue to introduce them. And you'll have to unmute Ed when you get set up there. So like I said, this is a student group connecting from Our Lady of the Rockies High School in Calgary, Alberta. This was actually a multi-year project where we had students who were in grade 12 at the time completing this project. And then unfortunately, due to COVID and some helium transfer lines at CLS that we won't talk about, their project had to get postponed, and they passed it along to the students that are here today to share their story. So this group was interested in looking at the impact of the 2013 Calgary flood and the impact it had on the environment, specifically looking at trembling aspen tree cores, as well as soil samples. And they partnered with their mentor, Dr. Colin Laroque, as well as the Mistik Askîwin Dendrochronology lab to collect their data at Mad Lab, as well as on Ideas Beamline. So with that, I'm going to pass it to the students. You're going to unmute yourselves and tell us what you learned.
All right. Hello, I'm Mark, grade 12.
That works.
I'm Patrick. I'm in grade 12 as well. I'm Morgan, also in grade 12.
I'm Sam. I'm also in grade 12.
I'm Paige. I'm also in grade 12.
So we're located in Calgary at Our Lady of the Rockies High School. We're the second project to work on this due to COVID-19. So our data was collected from a previous group, but we drew the conclusions. So we're located in Calgary over here, and then CLS is located in Saskatoon, in Saskatchewan. And now I'll say the land acknowledgements. So for Our Lady of the Rockies, the Creator gifted us with this land that we are blessed to share and care for together. Our Lady of the Rockies, located in Calgary, Alberta, acknowledges that the land we gather on, Mohkinstsis, is the ancestral territory of the Siksika, the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Askîwin Piikani. We acknowledge all Treaty 7 signatories, including the Tsuut'ina people, as well as the Ihar, Nakota Nations, Bearpaw, Chiniki, and Wesley. This land is also the home of Métis Nation Region 3 and all others who call this place home. And the land acknowledgement for CLS. The CLS in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan is located on Treaty 6 land in the traditional territories of the Niueak, Anishinaabe, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. We dedicate ourselves to moving forward in the spirit of partnership, reconciliation, and collaboration. So if you don't know, the Calgary flood occurred in 2013 on June 19th. The flood swept through the city of Calgary, costing upward of $6 billion in financial losses. Additionally, 80,000 people were affected and displaced from their homes. Many industrial areas were also flooded, causing the chemicals to seep into the water and the surrounding environment. With the flood occurring between June 19th and July 12th of 2013, many people have moved on with their lives, as they don't see how they are still being affected to this day. Our research aims to answer the general question on how this still has an impact on us today and how we can prepare in the future for similar events. Many cities have rivers flowing through them. In Calgary, we have the Bow River flowing through the central and heart of downtown and into nearby industrial areas. In Saskatoon, where the CLS is, the South Saskatchewan River flows through the city, going right past the CLS and near the Marquee Industrial Complex, which, if a flood were to occur, could result in similar results to those seen in our research.
So our research question is if there's any evidence of harmful metal ions, particularly arsenic, being introduced to the trembling aspen species after the 2013 Calgary flood, indicating a negative environmental impact from industrial and household chemicals. We chose this research question because the water from the flood washed over roads into homes, basements, and parking garages, and underground electrical vaults. We would like to find out if there was an uptake of metal ions, arsenic specifically, and if there was an impact on the tree health of a trembling health aspen species. The trembling aspen species was chosen as a sample because it has a high tolerance for metal ions, making an ideal species to determine if arsenic and other metal ions are negatively impacting trees in flood areas. Our research could be applied to countries and communities that experience floods constantly, as our presence of these metals and plants could also affect the organisms that depend on these plants to survive. Our research can also be used by future researchers that are interested in studying the presence of heavy metals in soils and their impacts from 2013 Calgary floods. Due to the nature of floods, any substance dissolved in it can be moved and accumulate in a different location. Ions such as arsenic, chromium, and other metals present in households, businesses, and industries in large quantities can be dispersed into the environment, especially since the brown color of flow water indicates lower sediment movement, suggesting that there may have been an increased intake of arsenic and other metal ions by soil. We hypothesize that harmful ions from industries and household appliances will cause a negative impact on trembling aspen tree species. Considering all samples are connected by the Bow River, the downstream samples may have been the most harmful ions accumulated compared to the upstream samples, leading to decreased tree health after 2013 flood. Seeing the composition of tree cores can assist in answering our hypothesis.
The preceding group collected the samples we used for this project. The process used to collect samples consisted of two main parts: tree core collection and soil sample collection. The tree cores were taken from a variety of locations. Each location had two samples: a tree in the flood section of the river and a tree above the flood section. This way, we could compare the results of flood versus non-flooding. For the soil samples, they were taken at the base of each tree. This allows us to identify if the tree absorbed certain elements from the surrounding environment and have an environmental impact. Once the previous group had chosen the locations and obtained the necessary permits, they began the collection process. To obtain the tree cores, the group took the cores with an increment board, which is a special tool that allows the extraction of the wood tissue with minor injuries to the tree. The tree was also measured using a clinometer for height and measuring tape for diameter. After the extraction has been completed, the tree cores were placed into straws to avoid damage. For each soil sample, the group dug a hole 20 centimeters into the ground and collected the sample. After the collection was completed, the sample was placed into a container and labeled until used in XRF scans. Here's a map of our sample collection locations. Each location has two markers, a brown and a blue dot. The brown is our non-flooded location and the blue is our flooded location. This is one of our sample locations at Princess Island Park. Here you can see where we collected our flooded and non-flooded samples. Here's another example of our location at Beaumont Park. And here's the flooded sample, and then here's the non-flooded sample. MadLab is a research organization that is based in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, who investigates tree ring-related experiments across Canada. With their technologies, they are able to understand the climate history of various locations and artifacts, along with being able to determine the environmental impact caused by humans. They were an important aspect of our research project as they were the individuals who inspected our data and processed the results. Started by MadLab, the Industry Development Education Application Student Beamline is a section of the synchrotron where X-rays are used for XRF, XANES, and EXAS for the previous stated purposes. For our research, we utilize ideas for XRF of our tree cores and soil samples in collaboration with MadLab. The ideas Beamline was utilized to discover if arsenic and any other contaminants are present within the sample. X-ray fluorescence is a laboratory technique used to determine the amounts of different elements in a sample. It uses X-ray beams to measure how much of a certain element is present in a sample. This is important for our experiment as it allows us to determine the relative presence of elements via photon counts. And this is an example of XRF. And when examining XRF graphs, we must understand that each element has their own unique fluorescence pattern, which can be used to identify what type of elements are present in our samples. Each element will have the primary peak, which is aligned by the colored lines on the shown graph. This demonstrates the most probable electron transition as it requires the least amount of energy. The smaller peaks next to the primary peaks are called secondary peaks, which occurs when the electron transition of the element to the sample requires more energy than the primary peak.
These are, the tree core is a representation of the plant's age and health, as shown here. These are tree core samples from Calgary Park. The number of rings from the pith to the bark is the tree's age. The width of those rings represents its growth. Looking at the distance between the tree rings, a controlled sample, as shown here, had tighter rings in contrast to the flooded sample, indicating better growth in the flooded area. This graph represents the amount of tree ring growth of the flooded samples with respect to time. Looking at the 2013 ring growth, the length of the bars are larger than the previous years, with consecutive years increasing after the 2013, indicating that the flood increased tree ring growth. Over here is the growth in millimeters, and down here is the growth year. In contrast, this is the tree ring growth for the samples in the dry sections. Looking at the 2013 growth, the length of most of the bars are smaller than the previous years. Then in consecutive years, tree ring growth begins to decline, indicating non-flooded areas decreased in condition. XRF shows that the flooded tree has higher peaks of elements, specifically calcium, magnesium, manganese, and zinc, as you can see. The timeline represents the relative presence of elements in the tree's lifetime. This element timeline reveals that the peaks were sometime in the past. In the flood sample, there were decreases in all elements at the time of the flood. Flood sample is represented by this timeline on the left. While in the controlled sample, over here to the right, there were increases in all elements at the time of the flood, as indicated by this line. Just as a side note, the scales of the timeline are different with each sample. As you can see over here, calcium scales up to 30,000, while over here, it only scales up to 20,000. Each of these trees had a moderate rate of tree ring growth at the time of the flood. This tree location is quite unremarkable as it does not prove or deny our hypothesis. These are the graphs for Beaumont Park. XRF shows that The flooded tree has higher peaks of elements, specifically in calcium, manganese, iron, and zinc. The timeline reveals spikes and dips in element presence. Additionally, flood 1 shows better growth than the controlled tree. Once again, the flood tree is on the left and our control is on the right. In the flooded sample, there are decreases in iron, with increases in manganese, nickel, and copper. On the controlled sample, there were decreases in manganese, nickel, and copper, with increases in iron. Both samples had decreases in potassium, calcium, chromium, and zinc, and increases in titanium. Looking at tree ring width, the flooded sample had a moderate tree ring growth after the flood, while the controlled sample had a sharp decrease in tree ring growth after the flood. This proves how the flood helped the trees grow rather than inhibiting it like our original hypothesis.
Overall observation that we made is that the flood helped with the growth in the trembling aspen trees. In 4 out of our 5 cases, there was a noticeable increase in growth, with the 5th case having similar growth in both the flooded and non-flooded zones. Most elements increased in the flooded areas, with zinc and calcium being the most noticeable. We believe that the increase in zinc concentration comes from sediment being disturbed by the rushing water, and the increase in calcium coming from erosion from nearby rocks and along the side of the river, as well as the mountains to the west. We originally expected arsenic to be present within the trees and to see a change in growth due to this. While the soil samples did have trace amounts of arsenic present in both flooded and non-flooded zones, the trembling aspen did not absorb any detectable amounts of arsenic, therefore disproving our original hypothesis. With our samples being taken 8 years after the flood, many elements have been washed out from the original soil and new elements have been introduced into the tree. This will affect our results, as it is hard for us to determine when the trees actually took in the elements and if the trees took in the elements at the same time or not. Water hardness is the result of calcium and magnesium being present in the water supply. In Calgary, there are large amounts of calcium carbonate present from rocks eroding around the rivers and from the nearby mountains, making our water hard. Hard water results in a buildup of calcium carbonate on many surfaces, such as taps and shower heads in our homes. In the case of our tree samples, the calcium carbonate builds up on the roots of the trees, limiting the amount of water that actually gets into the tree. This may result in some trees getting more elements than others and will affect our results. While building up on the roots, calcium can also be absorbed into the tree, explaining the large amounts of calcium seen in our tree. Based on our research, our conclusions found that the flooded helped the trembling aspen tree in its growth. While helping this species, other species may be affected negatively, which is something that can be looked into. Being that the flood affected more than only trees, another question that may arise would be how animals are affected by the elements seen in our research. With arsenic being seen in our soil sample, this may have an effect on local animals, even though not being seen within our tree samples. The final question that we would have for future research is how specific metal ions affect the environment. With the scans we have, we can only see a general presence of elements and not their specific ions. With the Zane scan at the CLS, this can be looked into further to see if one ion is in greater concentration than the others. Our research would not have been possible without the collaboration of a wide range of people. As a group, we would like to thank Amanda Pfeiffer, the CLS Education Coordinator, who allows schools around the country to participate in CLS research, Colin Laroque, Department Head of Soil Science and Professor at the University of Saskatchewan, who helped us looking at the data and acted as a mentor to us throughout the entire process, David Murr, IDEA's Beamline scientist, the whole CLS team who keeps the facility running smoothly, the Natural Science and Engineering Council of Canada, who provides the CLS education team with their Promo Science grant, which funds education programs throughout the CLS, the City of Calgary, who allowed us to gather samples, Mr. Kozlowski for always keeping us moving forward, the previous team, Brendan, Yulia, Livia, and Owen, and for all of you who have taken time out of your busy days to listen to our presentation. We now open the floor to any questions that you may have.
This would be where we virtually clap. Yeah, is there any questions? Go ahead, Tracy.
What was your hypothesis that there would be increased arsenic in the soils based on?
So since we didn't create the research question, this would be a better question for Livia and Owen, who are in the call. So if you guys want to answer that, get dragged into this as well.
And the buck is passed.
To be honest, we haven't looked at this in a while, so we're just trying to kind of remember. I believe that we did do some research as to what was in most of the electrical devices and stuff that were flooded in downtown, and what could possibly be washed out of those. And then also, like, for just choosing arsenic in general, it is one of the more harmful substances that could be found by the Beamline. So that was part of our reason. I don't know if Liv wants to add to that or not.
Yeah, I believe there was also some reference to a group, maybe that was a little bit farther south on the Bow River, if I remember correctly, but they had done a project through the CLS as well, testing chemicals in general, and had found higher arsenic concentrations. So we felt that was a reasonable hypothesis to look for arsenic directly, as it came up in other samples in kind of an adjacent research project. So I think those were probably our main goals, I guess, looking for pollution in affecting the trembling aspen species.
Okay, thank you.
It's been a while. I think we started this close to 2 years ago. So
Yep, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? So that I don't monopolize? Everybody's so quiet.
I probably have a question for the current CLS team. We obviously, like I said, were involved 2 years ago and got to do a little bit more of the field work. But what was your favorite part of kind of having that data passed on to you and getting to interpret it? How did you find that?
So in my opinion, I mean, it was cool. The best thing to me was seeing how like your hypothesis can be disproven once you actually like collect the stuff. Like you guys thought that there'd be negative growth, but we saw in 4 of the 5 samples that there was like pretty significantly better growth. So it makes you like wonder why and how future research will lead to that. You guys have anything else?
Yeah. Yeah, this having been the first time this data was presented to us as well since our original collections, it was interesting to see those conclusions. So thank you guys for continuing this project forward for us.
All right, we did have a question in the chat. Is in the spectra showing calcium and manganese, etc., where would arsenic peak have been if it was there? We missed seeing it.
Let's see.
Yeah, just go back through this slide.
What thing? So the reason why you probably don't see the arsenic in the XRF spectra is because it probably got lost in the scatter peak over here. Yeah, particularly it would be around here, but as you can see, there's this scatter peak, which is basically just random rays, just bouncing around. So it can be properly detected. I hope that answers your question.
I have a question.
Go for it, Jay.
Why do you think what do you think the source of the calcium and zinc were Was it the river water or the soil?
So we believe the calcium came from like the mountains eroding just due to rain and stuff, and it being built up in the sediment at the bottom of the river. And then when the flood came, it like the amount of water and just the speed of the water brought that sediment up and carried the zinc and the calcium with it, and it brought it into the soils and into the trees.
Okay, thanks.
So I have a question. Forgive my post-COVID voice here. The question I have is kind of expanding beyond the trees. So after we had the flood in Calgary, some of the flooded areas later became the target for new suburbs. Do we have concern that some of the things that you've been measuring, some of the elements, either neutral or potentially negative elements, if that gets deposited into the soil of these new urban development areas, is there the potential for health issues down the road?
So from the data we gathered, we don't believe so, as there's not a lot of stuff, especially arsenic, which was the most harmful thing we looked at. There was a little bit in the soil, and it would be better for like a medical person to answer whether it would have a negative impact on health. But it didn't look like there was much in comparison to anything in our soil samples, and it's not even present in the trees.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I have one that I'm gonna ask, but I'd like to ask it last. So if anybody else has more questions, then please speak up. Okay, I will jump in then. So this has been a big project spanning, like you mentioned, a couple of years and a couple of different groups, and students have come and gone. And obviously,
Can we please get a custodian to the office? Custodian.
Yes, the custodian can go to the office. So over this time, you've obviously learned lots about floodwaters and spectra and arsenic and why it's there and isn't there and where these things might come from. And you've learned a lot of things about your project. You've also gone through a number of experiences that not a lot of high school students have had the opportunity to do. And so my question to you is, what have you learned in this experience? And this is extending also to the previous students, Livia, and I'm cheating because I'm reading her name, but so I don't know your name. But what are you going to take with you in your continued schooling or into your careers?
So in my opinion, the biggest thing I'll take away is that we're all just trying to learn, and that like you guys just as much as us just want to learn this stuff. It's not supposed to scare us or anything. It's something to know. It helped me work with the group that's around me that you guys can't see, and just work with people in general. And that's the biggest takeaway I took from it.
Cool, thank you.
Does have anything?
Yeah, I'd like each student to respond.
No, I'm fine. I have the same things.
I think one of the big things that I learned is that how science can be applied outside of a classroom and outside of labs in the real world, and how it can impact certain people. Yeah. That's it.
Nothing to add for the remaining group. No, you're talking.
Okay, Livia, because you have a different perspective in that you guys created this project and kind of got it going and then had to hand it off. And that's a completely different look at things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for myself, at least, a big thing for me, we started this project kind of in the end of grade 11 under Mr. Kozlowski, kind of a group of us from advanced placement chemistry formed this group. So I think for me, it was kind of an introduction to the scientific method and developing that hypothesis and actually going through the research and experimental process. And Ona and I are both at the University of Waterloo now for biomedical engineering. So I think for me, it was a big push kind of towards the science, but also towards the medicine side, a little bit more bio, a little bit more chemistry. So I think it influenced decisions that I made my undergraduate. And it was kind of confirmation that was a field that I was interested in.
Yeah, and I would say all the things is Livia, and also just that this was like my first introduction to like serious group work, I would say, like not just a project for marks or whatever. And even coming into my undergraduate now, I realize like how much group work there is here, but also will be in my future career. And I think it was super helpful to have that experience of having group work and not even like finishing that as a single group, but incorporating students as well. And I think, yeah, that really helped me to realize and develop some skills that I'll need in the future.
Okay, thank you. And now I'm going to put the pressure on Mr. Kozlowski and ask him similarly from a teacher's perspective. What have you taken from this experience that you might be able to use in your future?
Hi, my name is Ed Kozlowski. I really liked the project. First of all, the students came up with a wonderful project and followed through both groups and developing it and being able to hand it off to another group. That's a whole other kind of skill level, I think, that the students came across, and myself too. Typically, I'm able to start something and finish it within the semester because that's my timeline. You know, I get that, you know, those 4 or 5 months, and then I start again. And so how do I start something? And I don't want to use staff it, but in terms of, I guess, post-secondary and in the work world, it would be, how do I start something and help design it so that it can be staffed and continue and be maintained, even if some individuals move on, because we all know that every work site has people that will, you know, be part of a project, a research group in this case. But the reality is, you know, somebody will retire and someone will move on, someone will take a job someplace else. How do you design in processes and those staffing questions? In this case, it's student involvement processes, so that it's sustainable beyond a particular group. Because ultimately, I learned a whole lot that life happens, and you may indeed have to, you know, work with an entirely different, wonderful group, not any better, any worse, just different. And how do you do that? And that was very, very interesting on my end, because, like I said, for me, everything's very encapsulated. How do I expand that to not just a semester or certainly a year, but we're talking multiple years here. So yeah, going forward, I'm already thinking about kind of the next project and how do I make sure I bring in individuals from multiple years. And so there's that continuation process. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Yes, kudos to the entire teams of students and teachers and mentors. Very well done. Thank you. That was a nice story to hear. Is there anybody else who has any final questions to ask?
If not, we'll maybe leave it there. Oh, sorry, Dave, go ahead. If you're talking, Dave, you just have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay. Hey. So I just want to say it's an interesting project. I remember the original arsenic issue we had when we did this kind of similar with the soils back a million years ago. And just thought it was a great job. Good work. Very nice.
Yes, definitely was. And I think that's a good note to end on. I just want to give a shout out as well to the other two members of the previous team, Brendan and Yulia, if you're watching this. Good work for bringing the foundation of the project that this group then finished it off with. It was really well done. Very impressed with your work and with the group's work. And it was a great job on the seminar, hearing your story. And like Colin and I said that first round, like it was pretty remarkable what you had already done, and you definitely took it to the next level. So